Judith, Chapter 1. Arphaxad fortifies Ecbatana. In the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh, in the days of Arphaxad, who ruled over the Medes in Ecbatana. He is a king who built walls about Ecbatana with hewn stones, 3 cubits thick and 6 cubits long. He made the walls 70 cubits high and 50 cubits wide. At the gates he built towers 100 cubits high and 60 cubits wide at the foundations. And he made its gates, which were 70 cubits high and 40 cubits wide, so that his armies could march out in force, and his infantry form their ranks. It was in those days that King Nebuchadnezzar made war against King Arphaxad in a great plain which is on the borders of Rageh. He was joined by all the people of the hill country and all those who lived along the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Hydaspes, and in the plain where Arioch ruled Elymaeans. And many nations joined the forces of the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar issues ultimatum. And then Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Assyria, sent to all who lived in Persia and to all who lived in the west, those who lived in Cilicia and Damascus and Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon, and all who lived along the sea coast, and those among the nations of Carmel and Gilead, and Upper Galilee and the great plain of Esdraelon, and all who were in Samaria and its surrounding towns, and beyond the Jordan as far as Jerusalem and Bethany and Shiloh and Kadesh and the river of Egypt, and Taphanes and Ramses and the whole land of Goshen, even beyond Tanis and Memphis, and all who lived in Egypt as far as the borders of Ethiopia. But all who lived in the whole region disregarded the orders of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, and refused to join him in the war, for they were not afraid of him, but looked upon him as only one man. And they sent back his messengers empty-handed and shamefaced. Arphaxad is defeated. And then Nebuchadnezzar was very angry with his whole region, and swore by his throne and kingdom that he would surely take revenge on the whole territory of Cilicia and Damascus and Syria, that he would kill them by the sword, and also all the inhabitants of the land of Moab, and the people of Ammon, and all Judea, and every one in Egypt, as far as the coasts of the 2 seas. In the 17th year, he led his forces against King Arphaxad, and defeated him in battle, and overthrew the whole army of Arphaxad, and all his cavalry, and all his chariots. Thus he took possession of his cities, and came to Ecbatana, captured its towers, plundered its markets, and turned its beauty into shame. He captured Arphaxad on the mountains of Rageh, and struck him down with hunting spears, and he utterly destroyed him to this day. And then he returned with them to Nineveh, he and all his combined forces, a vast body of troops. And there he and his forces rested and feasted for 120 days. Judith, Chapter 2. The expedition against the west. In the 18th year, on the 22nd day of the 1st month, there was talk in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, about carrying out his revenge on the whole region, just as he said. He called together all his officers and all his nobles, and set forth to them his secret plan, and recounted fully with his own lips all the wickedness of the region. And it was decided that every one who had not obeyed his command should be destroyed. When he had finished setting forth his plan, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, called Holofernes, the chief general of his army, second only to himself, and said to him, "Thus says the great king, the Lord of the whole earth, when you leave my presence, take with you men, confident in their strength, to the number of 120,000 foot soldiers and 12,000 cavalry. Go and attack the whole west country, because they disobeyed my orders, and tell them to prepare earth and water, for I am coming against them in my anger, and will cover the whole face of the earth with the feet of my armies, and will hand them over to be plundered by my troops, till their wounded shall fill their valleys, and every brook and river shall be filled with their dead, and overflow, and I will lead them away captive to the ends of the whole earth. You shall go and seize all the territory for me in advance, and they will yield themselves to you. And you shall hold them for me till the day of their punishment. But if they refuse, your eye shall not spare, and you shall hand them over to slaughter and plunder throughout your whole region. For as I live and the power of my kingdom, what I have spoken, my hand will execute, and you take care not to transgress any of your sovereign's commands, but be sure to carry them out, just as I have ordered you, and do not delay about it. Campaign of Holofernes. And so Holofernes left the presence of his master, and called together all the commanders, generals, and officers of the Assyrian army, and mustered the picked troops by divisions as his lord had ordered him to do, 120,000 of them, together with 12,000 archers on his horseback. And he organized them as a great army is marshaled for a campaign. He collected a vast number of camels and asses and mules for transport, and innumerable sheep and oxen and goats for provision. Also plenty of food for every man, and a huge amount of gold and silver from the royal palace. So he set out with his whole army to go ahead of King Nebuchadnezzar, and to cover the whole face of the earth to the west with their chariots and horsemen, and picked troops of infantry. And along with him went a mixed crowd, like a swarm of locusts, like the dust of the earth, a multitude that could not be counted. They marched for 3 days from Nineveh to the plain of Bechteleth, and camped opposite Bechteleth, near the mountain which is to the north of Upper Cilicia. And from there Holofernes took his whole army, his infantry, cavalry, and chariots, and went up into the hill country, and ravaged Put and Lud, and plundered all the people of Rasis and the Ishmaelites who lived along the desert, south of the country of the Chellians. And then he followed the Euphrates and passed through Mesopotamia, and destroyed all the hilltop cities along the brook Abron, as far as the sea. He also seized the territory of Cilicia, and killed every one who resisted him, and came to the southern borders of Japheth, fronting toward Arabia. He surrounded all the Midianites, and burnt their tents, and plundered their sheepfolds. And then he went down onto the plain of Damascus during the wheat harvest, and burned all their fields, and destroyed their flocks and herds, and sacked their cities, and ravaged their lands, and put to death all their young men with the edge of the sword. So fear and terror of him fell upon all the people who lived along the seacoast, at Sidon and Tyre, and those who lived in Sur and Osina, and all who lived in Jamnia. Those who lived in Azotus and Ascalon feared him exceedingly. Judith chapter 3. Entreaties for peace. And so they sent messengers to sue for peace, and said, Behold, we the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, lie prostrate before you. Do with us whatever you will. Behold our buildings, and all our land, and all our wheat fields, and our flocks and herds, and all our sheepfolds, with their tents, lie before you. Do with them whatever you please. Our cities also, and the inhabitants are your slaves. Come and deal with them in any way that seems good to you. The men came to Holofernes and told him all this. And then he went down to the seacoast with his army, and stationed garrisons in the hilltop cities, and took picked men from them as his allies. And these people and all in the country round about welcomed him with garlands and dances and tambourines. And he demolished all their shrines, and cut down their sacred groves, for it had been given to him to destroy all the gods of the land, so that all nations should worship Nebuchadnezzar only, and all their tongues and tribes should call upon him as God. And then he came to the edge of Esdraelon, near Dothan, fronting the great ridge of Judea. Here, he camped between Geba and Scythopolis and remained for a whole month in order to assemble all the supplies for his army. Judith chapter 4. Judea on the alert. By this time, the people of Israel living in Judea heard of everything that Holofernes, the general of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Assyrians, had done to the nations, and how he had plundered and destroyed all their temples. They were therefore very greatly terrified at his approach, and were alarmed both for Jerusalem and for the temple of the Lord their God, for they had only recently returned from the captivity, and all the people of Judea were newly gathered together, and the sacred vessels and the altar and the temple had been consecrated after their profanation. So they sent to every district of Samaria, and to Kona, and Beth-horon, and Belmanin, and Jericho, and to Shobah, and Esora, and the valley of Silim, and immediately seized all the hill high tops, and fortified the villages on them, and stored up food in preparation for war. Since the fields had recently been harvested, and Joachim the high priest, who was in Jerusalem at the time, wrote to the people of Bethulia and Beto-Mesthaim, which faces Esdraelon opposite the plain near Dothan, ordering them to seize the passes up into the hills, since by them Judea could be invaded, and it was easy to stop any who tried to enter, for the approach was narrow, only wide enough for 2 men at the most. Prayer and penance. So the Israelites did as Joachim the high priest and the senate of the whole people of Israel in session at Jerusalem had given order. And every man of Israel cried out to God with great fervor, and they humbled themselves with much fasting, they and their wives, and their children, and their cattle, and every resident alien, and hired laborer, and purchased slave, they all girded themselves with sackcloth. And all the men and women of Israel, and their children living at Jerusalem, prostrated themselves before the temple, and put ashes on their heads, and spread out their sackcloth before the Lord. They even surrounded the altar with sackcloth, and cried out in unison, praying earnestly to the God of Israel, not to give up their infants as prey, and their wives as booty, and the cities they had inherited to be destroyed, and the sanctuary to be profaned and desecrated, to the malicious joy of the Gentiles. So the Lord heard their prayers and looked upon the affliction. For the people fasted many days throughout Judea and in Jerusalem before the sanctuary of the Lord Almighty. And Joachim the high priest and all the priests who stood before the Lord and ministered to the Lord with their loins girded with sackcloth, offered the continual burnt offerings and the vows and freewill offerings of the people. With ashes upon their turbans, they cried out to the Lord with all their might to look with favor upon the whole house of Israel. Judith chapter 5. Counsel against the Israelites. When Holofernes, the general of the Assyrian army, heard that the people of Israel had prepared for war and had closed the passes in the hills and fortified all the high hilltops and set up barricades in the plains, he was very angry. So he called together all the princes of Moab, and the commanders of Ammon, and all the governors of the coastland, and said to them, "Tell me, you Canaanites, what people is this that lives in the hill country? And what cities do they inhabit? How large is their army? And in what does their power or strength consist? Who rules over them as king, leading the army? And why have they alone all who live in the west refused to come out and meet me?" Achior's report. Then Achior, the leader of all the Ammonites, said to him, "Let my lord now hear a word from the mouth of your servant, and I will tell you the truth about this people that dwells in the nearby mountain district. No falsehood shall come from your servant's mouth. This people is descended from the Chaldeans, and at one time they lived in Mesopotamia, because they would not follow the gods of their fathers who were in Chaldea. For they had left the ways of their ancestors, and they worshipped the God of heaven. The God they had come to know Hence they drove them out from the presence of their gods, and they fled to Mesopotamia and lived there for a long time. And then their God commanded them to leave the place where they were living and go to the land of Canaan. There they settled and prospered with much gold and silver and very many cattle. And when a famine spread over Canaan, they went down to Egypt and lived there as long as they had food. And there they became a great multitude, so great that they could not be counted. So the king of Egypt, became hostile to them. He took advantage of them and set them to making bricks, and humbled them, and made slaves of them. And then they cried out to their God, and he afflicted the whole land of Egypt with incurable plagues, and so the Egyptians drove them out of their sight. And then God dried up the Red Sea before them, and he led them by the way of Sinai and Kadesh Barnea, and drove out all the people of the wilderness. So they lived in the land of the Amorites, and by their might destroyed all the inhabitants of Heshbon. And crossing over the Jordan, they took possession of all the hill country. And they drove out before them the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, and the Shemites, and all the Gergesites, and lived there a long time. And as long as they did not sin against their God, they prospered. For the God who hates iniquity is with them. But when they departed from the way which he had appointed for them, they were utterly defeated in many battles, and were led away captive to a foreign country. The temple of their God was razed to the ground, and their cities were captured by their enemies. But now they have returned to their God, and have come back from the places to which they were scattered, and have occupied Jerusalem where the sanctuary is, and have settled in the hill country because it was uninhabited. And now therefore, my Master and Lord, if there is any unwitting error in this people, and they sin against their God, and we find out their offense, and then we will go up and defeat them. But if there is no transgression in their nation, then let my Lord pass them by, for their Lord will defend them, and their God will protect them. And we shall be put to shame before the whole world. When Achior had finished saying this, all the men standing around the tent began to complain. Holofernes' officers and all the men from the sea coast and from Moab insisted that he must be put to death. For, they said, we will not be afraid of the Israelites. They are a people with no strength or power for making war. Therefore, let us go up, Lord Holofernes, and they will be devoured by your vast army.